Chapter 3, Philosophy in Crisis at a Level Close to the Empirical. Understanding the words crisis of philosophy simply implies the desire to see clearly at last into this activity that traditionally has precisely assumed the privileged role of seeing clearly into the human and the world. These words express the intention of casting a beam of clarity onto something that claims to bring light and yet whose face remains in shadow. They presuppose that this or that philosophy cannot be entirely satisfactory, and that the confrontation between various philosophies leaves zones of shadow between them, behind them or within them. These words will have no sense for the dogmatic, whether they are materialists or idealists, Marxists, Husserlians, Kantians, Thomists, and so forth. For every dogmatism, and for every dogmatist, if there is a crisis it is that of other people or other philosophies. Or else it is a fruitful crisis that will enable their philosophy and philosophy in general to advance, to bring itself up to date, to reach the level of a certain scientific discovery or technical innovation. Dogmatists always start from a definition of philosophy posed and proposed by their philosophy. They believe that they possess this precious treasure, the very concept of philosophy. But they do not. Here as elsewhere, the concept is only attained by comparing the elements of an ensemble in the terms of a multiplicity. Conceptual abstraction relates to a concrete history, an actual confrontation. In his preparatory studies for Capital, a contribution to the critique of political economy and the introduction to this critique, Marx explains how the concept of social labor could only be born and formulated in certain historical conditions. It was necessary for the division of labor to have reached a high degree, and for fragmented labors to constitute in practice a vast ensemble, that of social labor itself. Previously, men, slaves, peasants, artisans, labored. But this was not officially known. It was scarcely taken into account in philosophy or discourses on man. The invention of the first machines, and not just tools, made it possible at the same moment to glimpse the distant possibility of an emancipation of man in relation to labor, with machines doing the work. The concept of labor went together with the preconditions for non-labor. In an analogous manner, it is in their current dissolution that we grasp what the town and the city were. Hegel saw admirably this negative side, destructive and destroyed, of becoming conscious, which is so often taken as positive and only positive. Isn't this how it is with philosophy, that is, with the concept of philosophy? The history of philosophy has drawn all past philosophies from oblivion, with ever more refined methods. Alongside the imaginary museum of world and universal art, the perfect discotheque and cinema, we have the imaginary museum of philosophies. Philosophy is entering into culture, even in those countries and universities where it has the greatest difficulty acclimatizing, the Anglo-Saxon countries committed to empiricism and pragmatism. It is conquering the world at a giant's pace. It receives cultural and political support. Made official, it is in power in a large part of the world. The great ideological battles are waged on its ground. Isn't this the moment when its concept is determined and, as a consequence, according to dialectical thought, negated? In Marx's time, only the total revolutionary project, inseparable from the critique of the perfect system, that of Hegel, put philosophy in question. Today, as a global success, an effort towards cultural unity, philosophy has completed itself in its concept. Does it found a single life, a single praxis? Is it not rather a reflection, and thus a justification, of existing praxis? Philosophy is no longer content with being a conception of the world. It becomes genuinely worldwide. it also becomes worldly, a center of cultural radiation. It becomes world as philosophy. It worlds itself, semondialize. There is more than ever a philosophical world, not in the Marxist sense of a realization of philosophy, but in the traditional sense in which the world of the philosopher, of each philosopher, is asserted to be sole and true, solely true. Is this not the moment when this world dissolves? When its alienation leaps to the eye? When philosophy puts itself in question? We presuppose a basic lack of satisfaction as far as philosophy is concerned. In the nascent state, empirical and psychological, this dissatisfaction was bound up with the confrontation between several philosophical systems, that is, with the concept of philosophy, without which there is neither a history of philosophy nor a critique of philosophy. Born with the classic and inevitable confrontation of philosophies, the state of unease and discontent built up towards the confrontation between philosophies and practice, between conceptions of the world and the everyday, between the philosophy of socialism and socialist praxis, between Catholic philosophy and the practice of the church and religion, and so forth. We propose here to elucidate the concept of philosophy and the dissatisfaction, nascent or mature, that necessarily accompanies every philosophy. We shall explore this dissatisfaction. Philosophy will be illuminated in its crisis. Nothing reveals an essence more than its dissolution. The defender of philosophy will put forward a preliminary objection here. Philosophy as such is supposed to appear and be judged. Before what tribunal? That of common sense? The philosopher rejects this. For knowledge or philosophical wisdom, common sense is identified with unreason. Several times already, philosophy has appeared before good sense and common sense. Several times it has been condemned. It only emerged in better shape. Philosophy cannot accept the judgment of the non-philosophy that opposes it. The philosopher accepts only the judgment of his peers, after deliberation without a time frame fixed in advance, and reserving a right of appeal. Philosophy, as such, answers only to itself. Assuming that a sentence condemns it to death, it continues with greater strength. Socrates is immortal. To condemn philosophy is still to philosophize. This preliminary objection disappears in the name of the concept of philosophy itself. This concept envelops that of philosophical need, an educated and cultured need that is not without a double dissatisfaction, for on the one side we see man imprisoned in the common world of reality and earthly temporality, borne down by need and poverty, hard-pressed by nature, enmeshed in matter, sensuous ends and their enjoyment, mastered and carried away by natural impulses and passions. On the other side, he lifts himself to eternal ideas, to the realm of thought and freedom, gives to himself, as will, universal laws and prescriptions, strips the world of its enlivened and flowering reality and dissolves it into abstractions. But for modern culture and its intellect this discordance, Zwiespaltkeit, in life and consciousness involves the demand that such a contradiction be resolved. One aspect of this double dissatisfaction involves, on the one hand, reality such as it is in common sense, and, on the other hand, abstraction as already developed, including ideas already circulating in philosophies. The philosopher rejects common sense, because from its origins philosophy challenges the reality that common sense, as robust champion of the real, ratifies and with which it rests content. Dissatisfaction, the principle of philosophical invention, turns sooner or later against philosophical ideas. If the essential thing about philosophical research and its initial act consisted in a challenge to and a judgment of the real, this This critique casts a light on philosophy considered real, that is, as entering or having entered into the world. Philosophy is thus summoned before the fundamental demand resulting from the split between the real and the idea. It is impossible for the philosopher to reject this instance and appeal, without already denying himself. On the other hand, pursuing the same metaphor, convocation before this tribunal already contains themes that will lead to condemnation. Philosophy cannot resolve the split from which it starts. It can only explore endlessly and bottomlessly the philosophical need. In fact, it responds to the split with representations born from the division, split, between the real and the representation. To put it another way, man cannot expect plenitude from philosophy, since philosophy expresses directly or indirectly the dissatisfaction of man and the internal split of his existence. Along the way, we pass from circumstantial symptoms, those of the present crisis, to more serious difficulties, those of philosophy as a whole. Criticism can define these difficulties as aporias, or antinomies, of philosophical reason. These aporias are not, it seems, those of speculative reason, but rather those of philosophy as such, including critical philosophy that does not proceed to its end point, that is, the critique of philosophy. We are reaching the root, fond, of the question. Let us not go too quickly. Let us not jump over the linkages and mediations. The slightest error has its consequences. To first aporia, the domain, either the philosopher and philosophy possess a specific domain, or they do not. If the philosopher has his domain, whether in knowledge, in wisdom, in being or, finally, in the effort to draw from the particular sciences a picture of the universe, this domain is reserved for him. Entry into this domain demands a preliminary procedure, an epoch, a distancing that situates the philosopher outside of everyday life, outside of praxis. This procedure involves ascesis and separation, split. Reflection changes into wanting a philosophy, into the desire to philosophize, into philosophical culture. From this point on, the philosopher is established in his private domain, house, castle, fortress. He is isolated and becomes a private philosopher. His relationship with knowledge, if he wanted to know, or wisdom, if he wanted wisdom, is disturbed. He will force his intimate concerns to take the form of philosophical dignity. His knowledge and wisdom will only have a sense within the philosophical world constituted by his retreat. Let us now assume that the philosopher does not possess a private domain. Then he falls into the public domain. Philosophy becomes above all a matter of teaching, pedagogy, general culture, or perhaps rhetoric. Anyone can enter it, on condition that they do not bring their own flowers, as in the Garden of Tarbes. Free philosophy soon becomes public service, affairs of state. The philosopher and philosophy die after a long period of poverty, misere, as they no longer have anything of their own. They perish from cold and hunger. Do we need a long illustration of this antinomy by recalling the opposition between Hegelian philosophy and the thought of Kierkegaard? For Hegel, the philosopher was in the state, part of the state, a servant of the state, an apologist for the state. According to Kierkegaard, philosophy is a private and secret business. In both cases, philosophy perishes. If we want to escape this impasse, that is, the contradiction between private and public, by going beyond it, we have to discover a different form of thought than the philosophical. Second aporia, praxis. The philosopher may grant that there are no specifically philosophical problems, but rather human problems, cultural or social problems. In this case, there is no privileged regard or particular right to speech. Everyone may say their word, formulate their opinion and their appreciation, propose their solution to these problems. The philosopher's opinion is simply one opinion among others, perhaps better presented and better argued, but in no way distinguished from others as truth is from error or approximation. Or the philosopher maintains that he is a man for problems, or the man of problems, and that he has problems that are his own particular ones, a problematic. He will draw up a list of these problems: soul and body, being and thought, essence and existence, immanence and transcendence, theory and practice, knowledge and action, consciousness and reality, subject and object, and so forth. Thus he will have beneath his eyes, stuck to his wall, his table of categories, his panoply of problems, his list of pertinent oppositions. This being the case, these differences, between being and thought, and so on, may be posed as real differences in man, in practice, in being, with these terms denoting splits, conflicts. Then the splits have to be overcome in order to resolve the problems. To reach difference in unity, unity has to be realized or rediscovered. And only a real, practical energy can resolve actual problems. Only an active, poetic, creative thought, a form of energy that is practical and based on a praxis, can cross the point at which differences, contraries, oppositions, contradictions, confront one another and rigidify in an endless confrontation. The resolution of the theoretical antitheses is by no means merely a problem of understanding, but a real problem of life, which philosophy could not resolve precisely because it conceived this problem as merely a theoretical one. For from this point on, subjectivism and objectivism, spiritualism and materialism, activity and passivity, lose their existence as contraries to make way for practical energy. 5. Alternatively, these differences, between being and the knowledge of being, and so forth, are themselves abstract. They exist only for representation. In this case, a new abstraction and an improved philosophical representation may claim to resolve them, by attaining, but only in the abstract, in representation, unity and totality. And philosophy continues as abstract representation, sinking into reflexive abstraction and representation. 6. Third aporia, universality. The philosopher proclaims his need for universality, his desire for the universal. Philosophical thought calls itself universal and seeks to be so. Let us leave aside, for any philosophy, the obstacle of other philosophies. Let us consider only the non-philosophical world. In the first of two possible interpretations, philosophy declares that it has already absorbed the non-philosophical world, the entire world, and that the system is complete. Universality is attained only at the price of an assertion that is hard to maintain. The whole world is occupied by philosophy. Philosophy coincides with the world. Being is exhausted. Time now will be filled only by the contemplation of the finished system, of completely revealed being. Apostrophe spirit necessarily appears in time, and it appears in time just so long as it has not grasped its pure notion, that is, has not annulled time. Time, therefore, appears as the destiny and necessity of spirit that is not yet complete, Hegel peremptorily decrees in the final pages of the Phenomenology. 7. And he goes on to add that history is simply the becoming of spirit completed in time. 8. The universal system, in completing time, filling it, thus also terminates history. By filling accomplished time, it leaves open the time to come. Therefore either the universal, along with truth, is found at the beginning of philosophy, in the principles and premises of a deduction, in presuppositions. In this case, philosophy is closed and completed right at the start. Or else, the universal reveals itself along with the true. It is found at the end. It is reached by being realized. Or else again, philosophy cannot remain philosophical. The non-philosophical world persists in the face of philosophy, and the philosophical world, whether as determined adversary and tenacious reality, or as a residue hard to reduce, lived experience or the empirical. In this case, the universality attained is only fictitious. The conflict between the philosophical world, philosophy that seeks to be world, and the non-philosophical world will not proceed without damage to philosophy and the philosopher. To escape from this and resolve the conflict, there is only one way, for philosophy to become world, not as philosophy, but as a project that is realized in the world, denied by its very realization as this supersedes it. Then the philosophical world and the non-philosophical world will lose their one-sidedness and will both be overcome. The realization of philosophy will make simultaneously for its grandeur and its loss. Time will continue, fertilized by philosophy and in no way destroyed by it. Fourth aporia, totality, first aspect of the philosophical difficulty, the notion of totality imposes itself. It is indispensable. Without it, knowledge is dispersed. It accepts the fragmented division of labor without challenging it, without the hope of dominating it. It falls to the rank of pure and simple statement of facts. It is faced with a chaos, the dust of empirical facts. In the human sciences its importance is still greater, if that is possible, than in the natural sciences. Moreover, no revolution is possible if totality is not put in question in praxis, on the basis of a challenge or negation that, to start with, can only touch on part of the ensemble. Ensembles, groups, forms, moreover, are facts just as much as are individual phenomena, the fragments and parts. Yet, if we start from totality, and as soon as we do start from it, reflection deduces or constructs arbitrarily instead of studying the facts. It systematizes. There is always a great risk of passing from the partial to the total, concluding from the part to the ensemble. Dogmatism is the least danger for reflection of this kind. When it is accompanied by action and command, it can go as far as totalitarianism, under the cover of realization of a social fact or a total humanity. Besides, is not the concept of totality one of the least utilizable today? Nothing guarantees the immanence of totality. Of what totality? Consciousness, being? In each partial assertion or each negation of each compartmentalized reality. Totality, to the extent that there can be a question of such, reaches us only in fragmentary form. The real, human totality of our day is neither capitalism, as in Marx's time, nor a state that is both ideal and real, as with Hegel, nor socialism, as the dogmatic claim, constantly presenting socialist society as accomplished or close to being so, but a broken totality. Culture itself, which has been substituted without warning for style, is dissociated. Despite the claims of culturalism, it becomes a mosaic culture. The technical and social division of labor, the compartmentalization of research and perspectives, fragmented. It no longer constitutes a unity, but a juxtaposition of domains, sectors, points of view, techniques, art and knowledge mixed together and yet broken. How can there be a coherent discussion of totality except by putting the concept in question? But on the basis of what? Of consciousness? Apostrophe for me, consciousness develops and expands with the blossoming of intelligence. It is equal to the universe, or more exactly constitutes this, asserting at the same time its own value as subject and the value of its objects, Léon Brunschvig declared in a memorable debate at the Société Française de Philosophie, on the 24th of February 1921. 9. For J.P. Sartre, totalization is also accomplished starting from the thinking I, that is, from the philosopher. We shall see how Claude Lévi-Strauss rejects this assertion, once the philosopher seeks to attain history and constitute it into totality. Yet he makes the same claim for his own part, starting from the intellect and the limited representation, the structure. We reject here both these symmetrical attempts. Philosophy seeks to be the totality of human experience or of human knowledge. Yet it can no more attain totality than it can universality. Knowledge discovers the new. The totality reached and formulated cannot claim to be definitive. Either it denies the creative discovery of the new, or it determines this in a way that destroys it. The experience of the philosopher, or the philosophical experience, cannot coincide with the entire human experience. The philosopher conscious of these difficulties will subtly emphasize a more dynamic concept, totalization. If there is always new totalization, imposing itself as such, of the new in knowledge or lived experience, a totalization always repeated and recommenced, nothing guarantees the philosopher that this totalization will be philosophical. It may, for example, be religious, or political. The state is also by nature totalization. The church likewise, has a religious form of state. The philosopher will either let philosophical totalization be identified with political or religious totalization, or he will protest against this in vain. If praxis makes itself totalizing outside of philosophy, pragmatically, without philosophy, then the philosopher will again protest, in vain. Today, technology seeks to be totalizing. It is so. It projects a totalitarian control into praxis, a control of praxis. It seeks to automatize the whole of human life. The notion of totalization is thus more dangerous than ever. Final point. The moment when philosophy renounces totality to take refuge in a totalization which it admits to be always incomplete, always repeated, it is perhaps a totality that effectively expresses the being to which man aspires. Does he not seek to live totally? Can his abandonings and disappointments bear on totality? Does he not continue to always seek, through trials, through empirical limitations, to become total man? Does he not obscurely reject whatever denies this totality, a rejection that bears its chance, which is our only chance? Though he seems remote to us, broken as we are by specialized work and compartmentalized specialisms in the sciences of human reality, total man is close. He is what is closest of all. We are already this possible totality, matter and spirit, consciousness and being, life and lucidity, play, work, love, rest, knowledge. Apostrophe become what you are. 10 is not the command precisely to construct in praxis, through praxis, a new totality that will no longer be that of philosophy as such, no longer thought and reflection, but act? For want of this, if it proved impossible, the philosopher would triumph. He would continue his totalizing, exploits and undertakings on the ruins of man and human being, among the debris of a life and culture in pieces, under cover of a technicality that he either accepts or fruitlessly challenges. Totalization would permit philosophical eclecticisms that are pleasing and inconsequential. In this sense, metaphilosophical thought does not reproach the philosopher, in the vulgar way, for speaking of everything, but, on the contrary, for not being able to speak of everything, for not posing all the problems that he should pose, those of totality. For reasons that are already clear, but that will subsequently appear ever more in their imperative clarity, we shall substitute for the concept of totality that of world and worldness, demande et demondialité. The claim of philosophy, which sought to start from totality and, by a reverse and reciprocal movement, arrive at the total, can no longer be sustained. It confused the total with the universal, whereas our planet is only a point in the universe and a relatively stable figure in infinite nature. The Earth is our world, and what extends to the whole Earth worlds itself, semondialize. Totality, or rather partial totalizations, since totality conceived systematically as shattered, is defined by mondialization. Thus technology worlds itself. At all events, we have to guard against abuses of this concept. If everything is needed to make a world, this is not made with just anything. It is possible to, world, modifier, this or that, scarcity or abundance, work or leisure, art in general or one art in particular, or else a particular work. The increasingly frequent use of the term shows that it is imposing itself. At the same time, it is used in a mystic and arbitrary manner. People talk of a world in connection with no matter what painting, novel or poem. The nascent concept of worldness is transformed into a figure of rhetoric, a subjective impression, an emotional attitude that exalts the undetermined. We have to attach the concept to the description and critical analysis of well-determined processes, or ones by which a reality, for example, technology or the state, becomes worldwide. Between the worldwide, the terrestrial, the planetary, there are close links but also differences that we shall have to emphasize. Only in this way will we have superseded the speculative difficulties arising from totality, conceived with too great a lack of precision. We will have located the metaphilosophical meditation. Fifth aporia, indifference. What does being a philosopher, having a philosophy, mean in everyday language? People see philosophers as curious beings, remarkable in either a good sense or a bad, as people who are not like them. A contemporary thinker noted, one of those who seek to rescue philosophy, with a heroism worthy of another age. 11. Being philosophical means attaining indifference. If this is how popular wisdom judges philosophical wisdom, with envy and severity, are not philosophy and philosophers to a certain degree responsible? The masses, without having to spell out the meaning of this term, so often abuse to exalt or deprecate the reality it denotes, are not always right. It could be that they are not entirely wrong in their spontaneous verdict on philosophy. It could be that the philosopher, even when he does not believe himself indifferent, even when he is far from disinterested, even passionately interested, in political problems, remains somewhat indifferent to the masses, who for their part have their problems, those of everyday life for example, which they perceive and seek to resolve otherwise than by philosophical reflection. Apropos, several philosophers, Spinoza, Schelling and Schopenhauer, for example, critical analysis rapidly detects an oddness about speculation. This posits sooner or later a principle that it calls absolute, substance, causa sui, grund or even ergrund, if not ungrund, in itself, idea, being, and so forth. Such a principle, prior to its manifestations, implications or consequences, is as a principle indifferent to them. Philosophy, from start to finish, swings between two responses to the question what is being? Its first response is to converge this with human consciousness. It personalizes it. The principle ceases to be posited and posit itself with indifference to its consequences. It loves, it desires. It is a God that is touched by human fate, but then it falls into finitude. This humanly satisfying principle, one even agreeable and comfortable, the object of various sentiments and sentimentality, bears the human imprint. Philosophy falls into anthropomorphism and magic. In the second response, the principle is posited and posits itself at an infinite distance. Man reaches it only by determining it, that is to say, negatively, by denying it and denying himself. This satisfies contemplative and speculative thought, while its principle becomes inhuman. It is indifference, Gleichgültigkeit, with its attributes of superabundant creation, cruelty towards beings cast into existence, waste, absolute play with being and nothingness. Philosophy has never been able to choose, and cannot choose, between the dog as barking animal and the dog as celestial constellation, in the images, symbols or metaphors invented by Spinoza. It can only hesitate or swing between two poles, magic that brings being closer by evoking it so as to identify with it, and speculative purity that takes its distance and loses it by losing itself. How could the principle posited by the philosopher not react on philosophical consciousness? Here we see it with its hard kernel of indifference, incorruptible but insensible. Those who say indifference do not say innocence. Our project here is not to organize a dialogue, following the guise and mode of dialogues between philosophers and non-philosophers. It is not to vindicate the common opinion against philosophy. It is to supersede this contradiction, by showing that what escaped the philosopher and assumes the face of ordinary, everyday, man is no less precious. The irreducible residue resulting from the philosophizing attitude, suspension of the everyday, is a deserving object of reflection. Sixth aporia, subjectivity. In our day, the philosopher likes to proclaim himself defender and spokesperson of subjectivity against the hard objectivism of the sciences and technologies and the impersonality of dogmas. It is all too true that subjectivity has need of defenders to speak for it and protest in its favor. The institutional world works flat out to prune subjectivity and cut off whatever tries to supersede. On one side and another, in one way or another, with very varied techniques, subjectivity is overwhelmed, exploited, utilized, denied. Propaganda, journalism, means of mass communication, all bear down on subjectivity, masking its own exaggerations and its own failure. The reification of a great number of human relations, alienation in objects taken to an extreme, leads to deceptive protest and demand, deceptive as it soon forgets that the operations effected on subjectivity from outside use subjective means, myths, symbols, images. As a result, by claiming its freedom and right to existence, subjectivity scarcely escapes what affects and alienates it. If it believes itself to be moving in a dimension of its own, or an appropriate one, it loses its way. The image is deployed in our culture, the image of photography and television, is particularly ambiguous and deceptive. It seems a fact and it contains dreams and myths, memories and illusions. It seems a given and it leads into a world of images. It seems objective and it releases the illusions of subjectivity. This is only pursued and believed to be attained in a world that is itself subjective, reflection of reflections, a pile-up of images. From this point on, it does not constitute itself as a free being. It simply loses itself in the labyrinth of a subjectivized objectivity, images, and an objective subjectivity, alienated and externalized relations. 12. In praxis, defense of subjectivity can no longer take the philosophical form. It has a domain and a precise meaning, defense of the individual against over-organization, productivism, bureaucracy. This defense of the individual can only be conceived in new terms, and no longer in terms of individualism or philosophical prise de conscience. When the philosopher sets himself up as the defender of subjectivity, of individual consciousness, the for itself, etc., he puts forward his own subjectivity. That is what he is speaking of, explicitly or not. Philosophy becomes the egology of the philosopher, with his I and his ego, constituted by this initial detachment, the philosophizing attitude. Even when he speaks and is not satisfied with just discourse, other people do not recognize themselves in the words of the philosopher. They find in them neither their complaints, nor their tumults, nor their silences, neither their abstentions, nor their acceptances, nor their refusals. Philosophical subjectivity does not coincide with human consciousness. It is a subjectivity of its own, a subjective world, that of the philosopher as such, described phenomenologically and constructed to the measure of man. No one understands this rather vain speech, but many believe that they understand it, given that they find themselves in an analogous situation, rather solitary, rather detached, rather overwhelmed by the world outside. The philosophical absence comes to fill by illusion the non-philosophical, yet only too real, impression of absence. The result is that, in order to grasp the situation of subjectivity today, with its appeals and aspirations, we have to emerge from philosophy as such, supersede philosophical subjectivity, regard what is happening and what is not happening within the dark bosom of a consciousness immersed in actual social practice, with its myths, symbols, images and signs. A sociological study is indispensable, but one that overspills the narrow horizon of specialized science and technology, following the demands of a thought freed from traditional philosophical frameworks. Let us strongly emphasize this point. Defense of subjectivity and individuality is freighted with subjective illusions by recourse to a subjective philosophical absolute in which it is as easy to lose one's way as it is on the side of the object. We have first of all to escape from the abstract dialectic of object-subject. Seventh aporia, alienation. Philosophy and the history of philosophy have bequeathed us, among other concepts, that of alienation. In a mystic or metaphysical form, by way of obscure visions or images, failure, fall, dereliction, decadence, etc., the concept of alienation runs through human thought from its origins up to Hegel and Marx. How can we grasp human reality today without this concept? How can we determine it and open it onto the possible? And yet the concept often embarrasses those who wish to use it, and its use is not without its questions. The immoderate, ontological use of the concept of alienation returns either to a mystical vision or to a metaphysical speculation. As with Hegel, for example, where becoming results from the alienation of the idea, where alienation is higher and deeper than contradiction, since it creates it. The concept abandons human reality. It makes it possible to soar over it and deny it ideally by seeing it as only the abstract alienation of an abstract general principle. According to Marx, this abstraction did not prevent Hegel, in his phenomenology and elsewhere, from attaining the human concrete, conditions, situations, dramas. It could be that, after Hegel and Marx, a speculative wielding of alienation no longer has this merit. In a manner both contrary and analogous, official Marxist thought, once more become systematic, fallen back into a philosophy of nature, has difficulty accepting the concept of alienation. If we remain on the terrain of philosophy, then either we attempt a philosophy of consciousness, and how would the pure transparency of consciousness alienate itself? It has a relationship with the other, but this relationship is not alienating, or we try a philosophy of nature, and how would there be alienation of nature? Thus either philosophy as such tends towards a philosophy of alienation, or it tends to eliminate the concept because it is dependent on other principles. As a consequence, we either release this concept from philosophy, or return to its abstract use. But what happens if it is released from philosophy, but remains caught in the architecture of systems? We have recently seen alienation become a literary and fashionable theme. In Italy, in particular, there are seasons and festivals of alienation. While philosophy that calls itself Marxist accepts this concept only with the greatest reticence, confining it to the history of Marx's thought, there is an abundant and fairly inoffensive literature of alienation in the capitalist countries. Fortunately, some serious and seriously critical work has arisen from this concept. When David Riesman, in The Lonely Crowd, distinguishes between inner-directed and other-directed, he describes man as alienated in present-day capitalism. He makes the concept of alienation an instrument of critical knowledge, if not of action. If we want to understand the situation of women in contemporary society, it is hard to dispense with alienation and not seek where women are in alienation and disalienation. But sociology is hardly enough. Does not the condition and situation of women contain both paradox and confusion, extreme ambiguity and extreme contradiction? Are women not at the same time nature and facticity, the finest creation and the depth of being? To understand this, philosophy is no more sufficient than is sociology or psychology. The study of films, the press, novels, and above all study of the actual condition of women in everyday life is more interesting than the themes of philosophy. What does this study of alienation lead to? To reforms that are minimal, even if of positive interest: half-time work for women, continuous working day, provision of crèches and kindergartens, etc., or to the project of a radical transformation of the everyday. In these two perspectives, which moreover, in terms of reforms and the revolutionary project, are not mutually exclusive, what role does the concept of alienation play when the question is to envisage a praxis? It leads to the demand for a creation. It does not go further forward. In other words, use of the concept of alienation can only be critical. This critique is either radical, or falls back into apology for the status quo. The concept of alienation has its limits. It beats a path, but is not enough to say what lies at the end of the road. Taken in isolation, it does not make it possible to discover solutions to the problems raised by alienating and alienated praxis. It does not supplement poiesis. Taken separately, it risks getting lost in considerations of detail, alienation of women, young people, work, etc., and finding a content and points of application only in the domain of specialized sciences, sociology, psychology, etc. Specialists, moreover, often of positivist inspiration, accept only with reticence a concept taken from philosophy. Wielded without precaution, it can be emptied of content and revert to a speculative use. Taken generally, as access to a total conception, it borders on this speculative use. The question is all the more intricate when we come to alienations of the second degree, no longer just by the thing, but by the gaze at the thing, no longer just by the real, but by the image of the real, no longer by subjective illusions on objectivity, but rather those of subjectivity. The critical use of the concept is all the more urgent, with a parallel increase in precautions, so as to avoid the dupery of a redemption by the concept, that is, by philosophy. The difficulty is all the greater, given that reflection in philosophy, or outside of philosophy, has brought to light a connected theme, the relation with the other. After Hegel and Marx, consciousness is no longer self-sufficient for philosophers. Even for those who, in the manner of phenomenology, Husserl, or existentialism, Sartre, still find the starting point of their philosophical reflection in consciousness, this consciousness is no longer defined by the strictly Cartesian cogito. It is relationship, intention, signification, hence connection with the other, the object, the thing, the work, the other person, or again and more remotely the foreign and the foreigner, the fascinator. The theme of alterity has invaded philosophical thought, and the ambiguous character of this theme, sometimes concrete, often abstract, conceals the difficulties of philosophy as such. We know already that Marxist thought does not propose as its central theme the relationship of individual consciousness with the other, the object, the other subject, etc. This relationship, or rather the various types of this relationship, fall rather to psychoanalysis, to sociology. Marxist thought meditates in a broader and more critical fashion on the relationship between social man, the man of praxis, and the products and works of his activity. There is a dialectical movement, that is to say, a contradiction, between these two aspects of activity, alterity and alienation. If alterity, or relationship with the other, is realized, alienation wanders and is lost. The two aspects of activity, its two poles, are mingled and confused. Philosophy, because it philosophizes, scarcely feels the need to discern these two aspects, to grasp their dramatic becoming. It thus leaves the ground open for the speculative use of the concepts, a ground that is uncertain, but where it feels itself at ease. It should get down to examining, in praxis, the relationship between man and works, this being other of social man. It prefers to transpose this dramatic and always concrete relationship into speculative relations between the in itself and the for itself, between essence and existence. The alienation quarrel has never been able to illuminate and give rise to reasoned discussions, as it challenges too many acquired attitudes and accepted representations, including the philosophical attitude in the representations made commonplace by philosophy. No one has been interested in enlightening these concepts, neither philosophers nor specialists in the social sciences, who prefer to confine themselves to anacritical positivism. Linked with these difficulties are those arising from the relationship between philosophy and politics. The philosopher has two choices. One is to leave political action, the political state, out of his thought. He refuses to take responsibility for political questions. His thought then no longer conceives and instead lets escape the totality. It distances itself from praxis, suffering all the more from this in proportion as it seeks to be more philosophical. If the philosopher rests content with an eclecticism that is barely coherent or systematic, if he more or less mistrusts politics as such, then he will accept existing political practice. He will bow down to the state and power. He will lack gravity and seriousness, negativity, in Hegelian terms. The philosopher's other alternative is to enter into political life, that is, bring politics and the state into his philosophy. He then must immediately make the painful choice between two paths, neither of which is philosophically satisfying. Will he produce a philosophy of power? Given that all state power demands a philosophy, every bureaucracy seeks a theory of being that justifies it. Will he move towards a system that, by encompassing the state, legitimates raison d'etat and hands it a philosophical certificate of good conduct and good manners? Will he move towards a pluralism that leaves him with free hands, but is philosophically no more than an intellectual game? Will he build the system of the future, the image of the ideal state? The difficulties become destructive when we have a state issuing from a revolution. Up to this point, traditional philosophy and the traditional philosopher could maintain themselves, and maintain their freedom, in the sphere of a moderate criticism of the state and politics, as was the case with Elaine. His formula of the citizen against powers 13 consecrated the political and the citizen, and demanded that political powers should be equitable towards citizens. But the victory of a socialist revolution in a barely industrialized country, leading to the strengthening of the state, forces a choice. The philosopher either changes into an executive agent, now that political power has a philosophy, or else he keeps silent as a philosopher. In the first case, philosophy triumphs, officially, and disappears. In the second, it withers away in the silence and impotence of the philosopher. A third option is scarcely any better: retreat into pure thought. Philosophy then dies of dehydration. Its philosophical alienation is absorbed into the total alienation of both philosopher and man. To escape from this, we have to follow in Marx's line, taking up the concepts of state, politics, and thus political alienation. Political theory must aim at the superseding of politics. On the basis of radical criticism, thought can study political acts and techniques, like any other technical activity, connecting them to another modern form of alienation, technological and technocratic alienation. By restoring them into the context of praxis, critical thought can judge them. Effectively or not? The question here is a subsidiary one. The revolutionary project rebounds. It takes back its fundamental character, to change the world and life. We are no longer in philosophy, but beyond it. 8th Aporia, Poetry and Poiesis. Philosophy as reflection and systematic elaboration develops an attitude, spelling out an initial position. What lies at the start of philosophy in general, and of every particular philosophy? An intuition? A vision? A concept? Or rather an act, a poetic word? Greek philosophy constituted itself as such by separating itself from poetry and the sciences, and from praxis. But no separation within creative activity can be complete and make a division. Formerly, before this split, before this division of labor and this specialization, philosophical speech and poetic speech were not distinguished. They remained bound up with praxis. And praxis was dominated by poiesis, by creative speech and act. The poet-philosopher knew the laws of the city. He could decide on them. He was political. Subsequently, praxis, pragmatic action on men, empirical management of human affairs, justified by ideologies, was established and prevailed. Philosophy, rejecting the specialized knowledge of the compartmentalized sciences, proclaimed itself knowledge and even absolute knowledge, but not without using fragments of knowledge borrowed precisely from these compartmentalized sciences. In an analogous way, it could never separate completely from poetry. Philosophical discourse formalized and developed its initial speech according to the rules of discourse, rhetoric and syntax. This speech introduced into discourse images and symbols, which do not escape discursive rigor but palpably shape it. Seeing itself expressly as truth, as accomplished truth about what has been accomplished, making itself mimesis without knowing it, imitation of what has already been said and done, philosophy could not however dispense with poiesis, that is to say, with a project. It projected an image of man. Consequently, philosophical discourse never consistently attained its formal aim, becoming purely discourse, purely philosophical. there is within philosophy and in its relationships with the world outside both ambiguity and misunderstanding, a fortunate ambiguity, the chance of a misunderstanding. Discourse passes from master to disciples, not despite of but on account of these ambiguities and misunderstandings, on account of words that underlie discourse and images or symbols that give impulse to concepts. In the belief that they are receiving concepts, hearer and reader also receive images and symbols. Systematization conceals an attempt, but the attempt of human forces, of the meiotic taken to a conclusion, inspires the system. The conclusion is happy and revivifying, and has to end up with a return to poetry and a new alliance between discourse and speech, concepts and the imagination. In Descartes, accordingly, running through his rationalism, we find a number of dominant images that are very familiar: the tree of science, the great book of the world. In Spinoza, the happiness of contemplative knowledge. In Leibniz, the harmony in the combinations, the vast symphony of the monades. In Kant, the idea of free choice in the absolute, the intelligible, through which the individual constitutes himself as such and creates the very thing that he believes himself to experience, and actually does experience, in the phenomenal and empirical, in space and time. And was not even the weighty and forceful Hegel, the man of perfect philosophical discourse, an initiate of the Rosicrucians? The cross signifies time, the crossroads of the present and a becoming between past and future, between action and passion, between the contradictions that move it. It is on this painful cross that the rose of the world grows, the flower of time that man must pluck, and that the philosopher is the first to enjoy. 14 is not the image of the owl of Minerva, of a twilight wisdom, equally expressive and meaningful? Does it not express the culmination of philosophy and of a world, the world that gave rise to philosophy? Does it not already signify, beyond this heavy and obsolete Hegel, the superseding of philosophy? Either philosophy continues to isolate itself from poiesis and from praxis, or else it rediscovers and recognizes, lucidly, the link that was never completely broken. Then it supersedes itself in the name of a new project and a new poetic word, a creative word that has to be found, by restoring poiesis into praxis and above it. 9th aporia, proof and discourse. Philosophers, as logicians and founders of systems, have formulated with great rigor the theory of proof. This has been studied principally in structures of mathematical discourse, in a discourse that probably represents the perfection of discourse once this has replaced words with signs and perfectly defined operations. Following this, philosophers transported into philosophical discourse the absolute requirement of proof, or the requirement of absolute proof, demonstration. The effort not to accept anything that has not been formally declared, the effort to show the validity of procedures step by step, has characterized philosophical thought ever more clearly. The quest for philosophical proof could be defined, from Spinoza on, by this demand for rigor in a domain that does not self-evidently allow for rigorous deduction or formally rigorous construction. The result is somewhat unexpected. The philosopher, in fact, prisoner of his own intention, abuses his rights. He takes the exercise of his speculative thought for rigor par excellence. The concern for rigor, devolved on philosophy, yields a style of rigor, a project of rigor, though not genuine rigor, proof. This infinitely precious proof indefinitely escapes philosophy. It suffers not only the torment of Sisyphus, always starting again, always climbing the same steep slope, hoisting the materials of the system to the top, but combined with it the torment of Tantalus, thirst for reality, hunger for proof. Each time that the philosopher, or someone else, seriously examines his premises, he discovers their presuppositions that are not explicit, that is to say, a content, direct or indirect borrowings from history, from praxis. The quest for proof is duplicated. On the one hand, the philosopher has vowed to make his postulates explicit, but he discovers that analysis and explanation can be infinite or indefinite. The question of proof then becomes that of the ultimate and unchallengeable foundation, last instance, last fact or act at which it is possible to stop. The philosopher has to stop, but he cannot. The foundation is constantly under scrutiny. It is questioned without cease. On what side, then, is proof to be found? Incoherence. The system proves itself by being coherent and compact. Logic prevails over the foundation, and form over content. The system, speculative analogy of God, is causa sui, and its truth is demonstrated by exhibiting it, verum index sui. This sufficiency is evident in the systematic form. The philosopher, accordingly, installs himself in a rigor of appearance, apparatus, and apparel, rigueur d'apparence, d'appareil et d'apparat. He despises empiricists and practitioners with their externality. He inhabits rigor. He makes it his dwelling, a rather cold one, with a pale dry light. But the power that decrees rigor and establishes itself there can also emerge from it by decree. Anyone who puts this or that in parentheses, this or that in the world, or the world as a whole, keeping only a fragment of it, but keeping it well and not admitting anything not elucidated on the basis of a will to rigor, finds out sooner or later that he has broken, or has finished breaking, the world as totality. He has broken the connections, replacing them with rigorously defined articulations. Yet he continues. In the name of rigor, he will have suspended rigor. Explanation turns out to be infinite, and yet a stop must be made. The first word of metaphysics is also its final word. The alpha and omega coincide. The circle closes. There is a circle, that is to say, a system. But what is there in this circle as such? Nothing. There is nothing. Not even the nothing. How could the philosopher have stayed for so long in the icy desert of a philosophical project reduced to the pure state, the pure form? He leaps from moral rigor to postulate without proof, the faith of Jaspers, the mystery of Gabriel Marcel, or, even with Husserl, a reprise of the metaphysical problem in transcendental phenomenology. Rigor changes into its opposite, once the philosopher perceives that he can neither provide the proof announced, nor suspend an existence that proves itself until its end, death. Extreme formal and rational rigor is transformed into absence of rigor in the silence of reason. The philosopher and philosophy may still find a refuge, logos, not this or that specialized language, but language itself. Philosophy proclaims itself logology, without smiling or fearing pleonism. The philosopher becomes a man of language in general, discovering in it the citadel, investissement, of truth. But he is besieged from all sides. The logician leads the attack, specialist in formal rigor and coherent discourse. He wants a language that is universal, demonstrative, usable by machines, based on a general semantics, hagiamatized and formalized after the model of mathematics. The most violent assault is waged by the champions of structuralism, the information and cybernetics theorists. They seek to occupy the sphere of discourse, to expel the other inhabitants, and from this point conduct raids and assaults on the neighboring domains and states. But the philosopher is also attacked by the writer, who wants a genuine tongue and language of his own, irreducible to discourse even at the price of a destruction of discourse, its structures and its laws. Is philosophy to be a kind of meta-language? Yes, inasmuch as the philosopher has his own vocabulary and substitutes his own discourse, on discourse, for spontaneous discourse. Yes, inasmuch as the philosopher uses metaphor in his own manner, replacing a customary term with other terms, and likewise metonymy, replacing an everyday word with a less current word, moving from the part to the whole, the relative to the absolute, which constitutes a jargon and risks, as we know, establishing a pathological state by making a break and division between elaborate discourse and everyday discourse. And yet, no. Only the logician, the semanticist and the semiologist can constitute meta-languages or, if they can manage to, the universal meta-language. The structuralist and cybernetic offensive is justified from this specialized point of view. Against the extension of traditional philosophy, a technocratic positivism or neopositivism can profit from the lacunas in this thought in order to proclaim itself the new philosophy. Classical philosophical discourse sought to be completely meaningful. But philosophers did not see very well that the informational and meaningful exist only in relation to a redundancy. The meaningful is the surprising, what is unforeseen in the use of the signs of the repertoire. Redundancy is intelligibility, and intelligibility is rigor. The desire for total meaningfulness and the desire for complete rigor, simultaneously present, confer on the discourse of philosophers a sometimes unbearable tension. Without knowing it, they seek to eliminate redundancy. Redundancy, that is to say, repetition, the already known, takes its revenge. Philosophical discourse, when it is no longer redundant but surprising, often ceases to be intelligible. Seeking intelligibility, philosophers wager on redundancy without knowing this. The philosopher of today seeks to establish himself in language. Yet he cannot be content with everyday discourse. If he adds nothing to this, he denies himself. Below language there is silence, a certain silence, in the region that is called by philosophy preperceptive, precognitive, prereflexive, or again infralinguistic. Above language there is another silence. It would be witty to say that a sleeve of silence envelops language. Above language, there is also the cry, the call, the poetic speech. Where is the philosopher to establish himself? In the silence below or in the silence above? In the infralinguistic or the superlinguistic? In the region of larval acts and impulses that await communication? In cries? In poetic speech? On the one side he encounters psychoanalysts, on the other side many people, mystics, poets. Doubtful associations that cannot fail to disturb and compromise him. There remains ordinary, current, language, discourse that is non-philosophical, by hypothesis, with which, by hypothesis, the philosopher cannot be satisfied. Philosophy then becomes what it has always been, revealing itself in its essence, discourse on discourse, second-degree discourse. The philosopher reflects on first-degree discourse. He reflects it. Perhaps he implicitly operates on the most general model of discourse, the paradigm of reflexive discourse, the quintessence. In praxis, ordinary people speak among themselves. As a function of their work, their social activities, they have such and such opinions, doxa. The philosopher reflects on these opinions formulated in everyday discourse. He substitutes for them reflected judgments and ripened concepts, freed from the incoherencies of practical discourse. He seeks out true opinion, which understands and dominates the diversity of empirical opinions and behaviors. He wants coherence. Unfortunately, second-degree discourse on discourse, if it does not constitute a particular terminology and transform itself into jargon, refers to everyday practical discourse as its source. It imitates everyday discourse, and aims in this imitation at a total and totally coherent discourse. It is mimesis. Reflection is imitation, and imitation reflects what it imitates. Philosophical discourse as the quintessence of commonplace discourse always risks offering only a weakened image or echo of real discourses after having purged them of some of their contradictions, their incoherencies, and consequently their richness. The mirror does not have all the dimensions of what it reflects, nor does imitation have those of what it imitates. As discourse on discourse, it ceaselessly and endlessly pursues its foundation and its proof. It risks transforming the world of discourse, entirely detached from praxis, into a philosophical truth, in which each person says whatever he likes and soliloquizes, without for all that meditating in solitude. 15. It is here that a path opened by Heidegger has its point of departure, if all ways of thinking, more or less perceptibly, lead through language in a manner that is extraordinary. 16. If language is more than a means of communication, if it is the dwelling place of being, then can philosophical thought not draw indications for a renewal from a very attentive examination of language? This suggestion is very worthy of consideration, all the more so as Heidegger supports it with admirable studies of logos, aletheia, physis, and so forth, which stimulates us to study in the same fashion praxis, techne, mimesis, poiesis, and so forth. Such work shows the point at which living language, caught in total historicity, supersedes the mechanics of discourse, and also overflows the sociologism and historicism that would attribute certain meanings in words, at a certain period, to country people, and certain different meanings to people already gathered in a town, which is not wrong but remains trivial. Language followed these mutations from rural life to the life of the city. Up to a certain point, it made them possible. It could not fail to contribute to creative acts, to foundings and foundations, either as reason or effect. Yet despite this, Heidegger does not escape the difficulty, aporia, if certain human works, for example a city, a law or a constitution, are only founded when named and spoken, it is hard to posit in truth that it is words that do things. If truth is poetry and poetry truth, what is their common source? Language alone? Language intervenes in all creation as a level of praxis. Does it constitute all creative activity? No. Not even in the original and poetic period of creation, naive and fresh. Why not appeal to the pre-Socratic thinkers in order to shape the new investigation, metaphilosophical thought, by restoring their words? Poetry clearly passes into language, but does it derive from language alone? And besides, if poetry has to be included in the superseding of philosophy, can we expect the realization of philosophy from language alone? The critical study of praxis and its contradictions, as well as of technology, must be included in the renewal of a meditation that would no longer be simply reflection and mimesis but, once more, act and poiesis. Heidegger wrote that philosophy is stumbling. It drags along far behind the problems of modernity and current praxis. He was right. It is not only far behind the problems of technology and nuclear danger, it is behind all along the line, along the whole front. To make up for this delay, do we not have to deliberately break the framework of this thought, expressly rejecting its limits and faults? 10th aporia, lived experience and history. Jean-Paul Sartre, in The Critique of Dialectical Reason, makes a titanic effort to resolve a problem that could already be glimpsed in his previous works, emerging from traditional philosophy still half unsealed. What problem is this? That of the confrontation between the lived, le vécu, and history. This problem encompasses that of language, since language gathers both the results of the everyday and those of history. Yet it is located on a different scale from customary exchange between interlocutors. Praxis has, among its other aspects, the repetitive and the creative, or the lived and the historical. These two sides of praxis do not go well together. They do not correspond. Neither reflects the other. There is little that the lived can be reduced to. It is a philosophical name for everydiness. One of the aspects of existentialism was the description of the everyday and its triviality, using terms that were still philosophical. This concealed the object, and paralyzed the critical procedure that could have proposed both to understand the everyday and to overcome it. The mediocrity of the lived, this immediate work of freedom, shattered the philosopher of free consciousness. Philosophical amplification and transcription failed to metamorphose the shabbiness of the lived. What is the lived? Nausea and bad faith, and unease, and embarrassment or torment under the gaze of the other. Now, well below and well above these wretched undertakings of freedom, there are the great undertakings of history. For history is grandiose. More, it is spectacular. Perhaps it is still something else, as people do not make history innocently. But from the standpoint of the philosopher, when he perceives it, unfolding well above what he writes and describes, history has grandeur. On the historical stage, great actors perform great tragic plays. Is the philosopher going to deflate history, tear the banners in which history covers itself and show the histrion and the tragedian? He may try. History resists. It is not easy to get rid of Homo historicus, his grandeur and his misery. How then to diminish the gap between the lived and the historical? There are many possibilities for doing this. In the name of a program to transform the lived, one can show its richness and the demands hidden beneath triviality. One can also show human alienation within the historical. One can move towards a total history that does not relate events in terms of their apparent grandeur or men in terms of what they have said of themselves, but reconsiders events and men in a different perspective of the undergone. One can posit anew, as fundamental demand, the reduction of the gap between the everyday and the state, that is to say, between the experienced and the historical. In other words, we can demand that the lived should lose its trivial character separate from the historical, and that the historical should cease to be practically separated from the experienced on account of being dominated by blind forces, by state and political powers. Sartre, however, blocks off these paths, because of his philosophical origins. He started out from the Cartesian cogito, from the separation between res cogitans and res extensa, which with him becomes an abyss between the for itself and the in itself, with the in itself taken as being, and the for itself as truth, this tremendous fissure being peopled with concrete existences that appear to be philosophically conceived but are in fact recorded empirically. No doubt Husserl took the same path. Fichte as well. The cogito opens onto the object, onto the other. The intentional seeks to bridge the distance and aim at the object. the method of description of consciousness is perfected. It approaches formal rigor. It classifies assiduously the problematic, the categorical, the thematic. It teaches the philosopher to put this or that in parentheses, the fragments of a world buried in its fragmentation, to the point that Sartre himself for a long while put history in parentheses, in being and nothingness. The philosopher knows what describing and spelling out means. Yet the speculative relationship between object and subject remains the central theme of this philosophy, which starts from individual consciousness. It forbids itself both access to being, natural or social, and access to history, the two things moreover being connected, if it is true that history is the history of human being. Levi-Strauss quite easily had the upper hand when he declared that the supposed totalizing continuity of the self is simply an illusion maintained by a certain social life. 17. Political life, too, we may add. Today Marxists, political men of action who use the Marxist vocabulary, make history. They operate with a summary ontology, materialism, which they need to justify themselves ideologically, and with a method sufficiently flexible to pass from pedagogical dogmatism to a dialectical subtlety close sometimes to the sophistic. This gigantesque historicity manufactured with the aid of a mediocre philosophy obsesses the excellent philosopher that Sartre is. No matter how degenerated, official Marxism still has enough striking force to shake a philosopher convinced of his rights. The positions that he adopts in the critique of dialectical reason have a manifold interest, both for diagnosing the exact point reached by the general crisis of philosophy and to locate the difficulties of a particular philosophical tendency, that which starts from the prise de conscience of the accomplished fact. The criticism of this non-critical criticism will enable us to make clear the notion of metaphilosophical thought. It is quite true that institutional Marxism has left aside questions relating to the individual. The attempts made by certain Marxists in this direction have been rejected by the official ideologists. There are also objective reasons for this rejection. The problem of the individual is a practical problem, that of his full and entire realization. Realization of the individual and realization of philosophy go together. The socialist societies, not being ripe for the superseding of philosophy, cannot tackle the problems of the individual in their praxis. Between the level of individual life and the totality of praxis, between the lived and history, Marxist thought has left an abyss that Sartre seeks to fill by restoring the mediations, in particular, intermediate groups. Problems then arise that are unresolved, posited badly or not at all. How do individuals participate in history? How can individual consciousness, that of the actor in the event, that of the witness who is or claims to be privileged, philosopher, historian, sociologist, accede to the total? How do action and comprehension become possible, that is to say, how and why does history become acting consciousness on the one hand, knowledge on the other? This problematic forms part of the requirements of a total history. In his intention to accomplish this program, Sartre contributes intuitions that are sometimes striking. It is true that most often he does not proceed to develop the intuition as far as the concept. He lets it drift. Thus he takes as his starting point need. 18 Subsequently, with Sartre as in Dionys Moscolo's earlier book Le Communisme, the dialectical movement of need remains below the sketch offered by Marx in the 1834 manuscripts. 19 Need is essentially defined as lack and scarcity, whereas Marx indicated its transformation, by the mediation of productive labor, into capacity for work and enjoyment, a need both individualized and socialized. It is no less interesting that Sartre introduces need into his presentation of practical ensembles on the basis of individual lived experience, du vécu individual. Just as he indicates a dialectical movement of alienation, desalienation, new alienation and this desalienation, and so on. 20 But the basis, not to say the foundation, of this dialectical movement does not go beyond a certain speculative narrowness, since the text mentioned has to do with the dialectical movement questioner questioned. In the wake of this, alienation for Sartre is almost always reduced to alterity, to perception of the other. Similarly again, we have the idea of a presence, and of the possible in the project. 21 The reader may regret that this idea is not developed or actualized in a genuine theory of the possible, at least in Volume 1. This regret presupposes an encounter with a productive idea. On the way, Sartre restores mediations, particularly those of intermediate groups, family, town, gatherings, etc. But he scarcely goes further than interpersonal relations. Is he able to go further? His philosophical concepts, consciousness, for itself, in itself, impede him from what he is seeking, access to the general. Until a new order, he remains with the partial while believing himself to be heading for the totality. At this level, he explains in an extremely intelligent fashion certain aspects of praxis, those that relate to the most conscious activity and that may be attributed to totalization by a conscious ego, mediations between individuals, between the individual and the historico-social. The mediation privileged in this way then tends to attenuate the contradictions in the dialectical movement itself. Seeking to fill the lacunae left in knowledge by official Marxism, Sartre ends up falling into sociologism and psychologism. The general anthropology to which he wants to make a decisive contribution is not always clearly distinguished from culturalist and structuralist anthropology. We already know why, and we will know this increasingly profoundly. These scientific tendencies have a division in common with the philosophy of Sartre. They separate human activity from nature and so mutilate praxis by reducing it to consciousness or to culture. Already in Sartre's introduction, Questions of Method, the reader notes that the author accepts under the label of Marxism the historical development of this thought. He accepts in this way the historical, but if he examines and criticizes it, he does so in a non-historical fashion, philosophically. Knowing full well that Marxism has changed into dogmatism, Sartre seeks the origin of this dogmatism in the philosophy of Marx, and consequently in a philosophy that he attributes to Marx without investigating any further. The source of this dogmatism lies in the basic problem of dialectical materialism. In setting the dialectic back on its feet, Marx revealed the true contradictions of realism. These contradictions were to be the very substance of knowledge, but they have been concealed. 22 By rejecting the Hegelian identity of being, doing and knowing, and consequently of history and truth, Marx, according to Sartre, promulgated a dualist monism. He was dualist because monist. 23 Marx, therefore, only established between being and knowing a problematic connection, instead of their metaphysical identity as with Hegel. But this is not quite exact. If Marx broke the Hegelian systematization, or rather if he noted its rupture, he grasped what Lévi-Strauss correctly calls the essence of change. 24 While challenging the validity of this concept, Sartre views Marxism philosophically. He defines it, following Hegel, as a philosophically problematized Hegelianism. Right from the start, he brings it into the categories of philosophy. He leaves aside the radical critique of philosophy as such, the theory of the practical superseding of philosophy, the theory of praxis. Marx saw political economy as the science of economy, in the sense of someone being economical. He criticized it while showing its awareness of the division, one that continues to the present day to be spontaneous and non-conscious, of labors and of goods in poor societies, dominated by castes and classes, who demand abstinence from other groups, and sometimes from themselves. Right, Le Droit, sanctioned and still does sanction this unequal and unjust division. The superseding of economics, that is to say, the end of penury, will go together with the superseding of this ancient and solemn right. Marx frequently alludes to societies that are already historical, but not in the sense of economic growth under capitalism, and still less so in the sense of a development that is at last conscious, known, mastered, thus genuinely historical, in socialism. He did not develop his theory, particularly that of the Asiatic mode of production, but he clearly showed its scope. Outside of the process of accumulation, on a base that had remained close to nature and the archaic community, vast political edifices, empires, were constructed, destined to collapse by stagnation or the regression of their base, if not by external conquest. In these societies, a certain surplus labor and a weak surplus product could be tapped by the dominant groups, appropriated for their leisure and their works. These dominant groups, who were not yet classes, still had to justify their privileged existence and activities, those of war, administration, ideology, to a community from which they were not completely separated. Among their works, one particularly stood out, on which we have already focused several times, the town, the city. We have to understand the double aspect of these societies, the reign of violence, but also creation in art, symbolism, style, culture, wisdom and finally philosophy. It is in this way alone that we can understand, not only those groups recorded by ethnography, but also the great imperial societies of Asia, pre-Columbian America, Greece and Rome. In some brilliant passages, 25 Sartre starts from need and discovers the world of scarcity. Having changed scarcity into world, he lets its contradictory aspects escape. They are only explained by the dialectical movement of need, reproduced by our thought through to the conditions in which desire is distinguished from need and becomes desire for creative work, for refined enjoyment, in violence or cruelty, in wisdom or grandeur. Hence the problem posited and not resolved by Marx. What is there to interest us in the works of these great social groups that established or maintained themselves by force, appropriating in penury the weak social surplus product? What is the source of the durable character of these works of art, of thought, superstructures, of societies that are outdated and often ferocious? Is the question of the depth of archaic works not bound up with that of desire? Do these works not address a deep desire, that for a style of life, a style of desire itself? Marx glimpsed this line of questioning, what becomes of art, wisdom and philosophy, these forms of nostalgia and hope, when penury disappears? Because Sartre wants to avoid a systematized philosophy of nature, dialectics of nature, yet still thinks in terms of philosophical systemization, he ends up purely and simply effacing the existence of nature. It has no place in his philosophy. Where do trees, animals, children fall, between the in itself and the for itself, being neither one thing nor the other? Along with nature, it is perhaps the essence of need and desire that escapes, which is rather more serious than not knowing where to locate the mere living being in the philosophical picture of the world. And so the philosopher carries through to the end the implications of any philosophy of consciousness, which can rigorously rediscover the object, but not physis or being. Nature manifests itself, according to his dialectical reason, as the ontological sector 26 of the anti-dialectic, the inert, the practico-inert. This qualification replaces the in itself of being in nothingness without great advantage, despite the attempt to insert it into praxis and history. It is true that there are things, with stability, structures and beings, in this determined sense. Can we reduce them to a world of things, to pure inertia? This table is a thing. Its wood is dead, or nearly so. To make the table, a tree has been killed. To the extent that the dead wood of this table continues to change, is not fixed in its death, the table changes and decays. It is true, therefore, that human labor often operates on the practico-inert, on the stable. It makes it inert. It stabilizes. It fixes. That said, we humans also deal with living trees. There are people who work to cultivate them, to produce fruit, and also to cut them down, to sow them, to shape them. The wood of a living tree is not absolutely different from the dead wood of this table, and yet it does differ. Besides, the table is a thing, perhaps a work of art that has a certain beauty. Apropos the tree, we can say with Hegel, and with Engels, the tree negates itself in the fruit. The negation of this fruit in the earth, negation of the negation, gives rise to another tree. 27. This is not wrong. One may wonder, however, if such statements add to our knowledge of trees. Besides, do they reproduce a genuine dialectical movement? What we have here is a cycle, thus a repetition, rather than a becoming, and it is hard to see contradictions at work, except very vaguely, the earth and the fruit, and so on. The question of dialectics in nature is thus raised. We may believe this is an acceptable hypothesis that, like all hypotheses, has to prove itself by its productiveness and not by the systematic interpretation of provisional facts and results of the sciences. Scientists can construct dialectical models for natural processes, and use these models. Nothing more. They do not have the right to change a model into an ontological truth. This remark is as valid for the waves and particles of quantum physics as for the tree and the fruit. That being so, it is curious to refuse concrete existence to nature by reducing it to a single dead thing, to the collection of things. That really is extending a hand to the most summary materialism, that of the raw and isolated thing. Nature, that is to say, being, resolves itself for Sartre into anti-dialectics, inertia. Neither the tree nor the animal, neither growth nor decline, finds a place in his philosophy. In contrast to Heidegger, he has not meditated on the physis of the ancient Greeks. He remains imprisoned by these categories, the mechanism of nature juxtaposed with the finalism of consciousness. This gives his thought a surprising aridity. Sartre reflects on things, stabilities, structures, as on the bones of a skeleton. This is the inert. These bones would have to be covered again with flesh, with living and conscious activity. Which is true. But he omits an important fact. The bones were born at the same time as the flesh, in organic growth. The bones were also living. The death that abandons them inert, when the fleshy life has disappeared, raises a question for us. Many questions, in fact, among which is that of analysis, which kills and which knows. When we pick up a dead shell from the beach, this shell has a structure. It makes it possible for us to classify the shell in a genus and a species. And yet it was the work of a living being, active and yet soft and barely structured. The dead wood, the dried-up vertebrate, the empty shell, that is Sartre's being. can we reply to questions concerning living being in terms of nothingness and death, that is to say, structures that life abandons and leaves behind? A great absence pervades Sartre's thought. Along with nature and being, reduced to the in itself, poetry disappears. As distinct from Heidegger, Sartre's thought destroys poetry as style and word, poiesis as concept. He thinks of doing. He does not meditate on production or creation. His philosophy tends towards a pure discourse that is too conscious and too organized. His dialectic becomes a dialectic internal to a consciousness opposed to the thing, inert. We know that Sartre starts from consciousness as act, as prototype of reality and intelligibility. And this even though he rejects transcendental consciousness. He conceives consciousness as existing in the act, not as metaphysical. And yet, from the fact that he conceives it as act, by itself, is it not still and always metaphysical? Consciousness according to him is no longer absolutely and originally closed, as in the Cartesian school, the cogito, the monad. Yet it is relatively closed, being determined and limited on the one hand, subjectively, by lack, and on the other hand, objectively, on the side of the object, by the thing, the inert that it has to deal with. This inert is simultaneously before consciousness and within it. That is how it determines consciousness. Consciousness opens towards the inert, and the inert encloses it. This consciousness, initially individual, rebounds in its struggle against its limits and its obstacles. In its relations with others, it becomes effervescent and beats against the obstacle, the inert. We then have an interindividual sociological process tending towards the historical. This is how the group is constituted, an important mediation, 28 both mediated by an event, immediate reality for the participants, and mediation towards something else in time. At each step, with each leap of consciousness, the inert reappears within it. Each form of the inert accompanies a consciousness both vis-a-vis and face-office with it, counter-finality, counter-group, anti-human, field of inertia, repetitive series, structures, sociality of inertias, and so forth. At each step, consciousness, the conscious dialectic or the dialectic of consciousness, experiences its limits anew and shatters them, laissez-faire éclater. In a series of explosions or effervescences, it constitutes ever larger in symbols, including those that make history, in particular, classes. To illustrate our criticism, let us take the city. Sartre cannot consider it as a work, created by poetic acts that founded a city, promulgated its law, defined its frame, incorporated its institutions, or those of society into monuments, and did so in relation to a praxis. For Sartre, the city can only be the inert frame in which effervescences, disturbances, revolutions are produced when the conjuncture is favorable. It is in this sense that Sartre tackles the study of classes and class relations. For him, class reality and class consciousness are not discovered on the basis of the economic level of capitalist society. He relegates the economic to the inert, and more precisely to the scarcity of things, the anti-human world. Nor is the consciousness of a class born against another class, so that contradiction appears only within a constituted consciousness, which presupposes its constitution. It is not created in a historical struggle, among complex forms of consciousness, ideologies, social consciousness, conscious fragments of praxis. It is created against the inertia that it contains, the demands of the practico-inert field. This constitution is produced within the group consciousness. Gatherings, and likewise classes, become groups by way of their internal tension. The class struggle is defined as superseding the inert of the collective towards dialectical groups of Combat 29, a formula that, by reducing the collective to the inert, delegates class struggle to the most conscious representatives of the class, to acting minorities, and finally to restricted groups. Are these parties, or simply activists and shock troops? Whatever the case, the outlet towards history is narrowed. Inevitably so, since by starting from consciousness and its effervescences, it is only possible to arrive at very conscious but restricted groups. And the real basis of these groups is forgotten. If we take the Paris Commune of 1871 to illustrate the analysis, what do we find in action? Small groups. No. The whole city with its organic elements, the quartiers. The city as ensemble, with its great social categories, artisans, workers, women, and then ideologies. The state appears up till now only in the manipulation of inert serialities. 30. It would be more interesting to tell us how the state renders active groups inert by manipulating them, transferring their activities to itself by taking hold of them. The works and products of human activity are defined at all levels by inertia alone. At each level the thing reappears in consciousness, at the same time as for and before it. Never, in our opinion, does Sartre grasp human activities in the movement in which they alienate themselves, going to the point of losing themselves in the work or the product, until they are reified. That is what prepares and heralds superseding. But is this dialectical movement not what is essential in capital? Sartre takes the thing and consciousness face to face. They arise together and rebound together. He presents them in an ambiguity between empiricism and ontology, between observation and speculative construction. And the transition, the passage from one aspect to another, is always missing, hence the dialectical contradiction and the dialectical movement themselves. He leaves aside the fundamental problem, the historical relationship between social man and his works. The wide program that Sartre set himself would be acceptable on condition of being elucidated, completed, put back on its feet. It is fated to attain only one part of history, the moments of high consciousness, those of effervescence. What we need, however, is not to subject praxis to the categories of a philosophy, but rather to resume the criticism and superseding of philosophy by deepening the study of praxis, distinguishing repetitive praxis and creative praxis, following the dialectical movement of the latter in history conceived totally. The question is not to provide a philosophical certificate for accomplished history by starting from the lived or the existential, but rather to also criticize history as fait accompli on the basis of a reprise of critical and dialectical thought. In this sense, with appropriate methods and concepts, without ruling out methods and concepts taken from philosophy, but transforming them, it is possible to envisage a new insertion of theoretical thought in creative praxis. A condition sine qua non is that the theory of the withering away of the state again returns to the agenda. If politics remains the key to the situation, this theory remains the key to Marxist political thought. It is free for those who so wish to reply that this theory is out of date, that Marx is authentic thought, and the restitution of this thought has only an anecdotal interest. It is also free for them to assert that dialogue must be established with Marxism as it has historically become, and not with Marx, with the thinkers of ancient Greece and other interlocutors. But then let this be said explicitly, that is, theoretically. In the form that it is presented, Sartre's program risks failure. He attempts a philosophical summa, heroically pursued, without any criterion, to distinguish the important from the accidental, without anything to indicate what concerns us by distinguishing it from what does not. In his own manner, with his presuppositions, he attempts a total history. Yet these same philosophical presuppositions prevent such historicity. We could judge still more severely the fact that this work, like any speculative construction, is content with a few tautologies, which take up a great deal of space without ever making clear what they actually are, being concealed beneath dialectical pseudo-movements. Here is one of these underlying tautologies. For there to be reification of activity, there have to be things. 31. This is not untrue. But a proposition of this kind, almost a caricature, gives rise to illusions. The reader believes he has thought, advanced, understood, learned something. He repeats a tautology. He is in a state of redundancy, of mimesis. He imitates more or less his philosophical master, who himself repeats an outrageous and trivial proposition. The real problem is to grasp at its particular level the movement of alienation that tends towards its structural limit, reification. It is to grasp a transition that Sartre's discussion leaps over by taking as essential the bare, dead result, at bottom tautological. This makes for an identification between structure and the inert, an identification in the name of which Sartre seems to us to bypass the problem of structures, equilibriums and stabilities, their relationship with becoming, in all the dimensions of praxis. He runs a strong risk of treating the categories of Marxism metaphysically, need, praxis, revolutionary action. He takes them, he separates them, he hypostatizes them and worlds, mendifi, them. The critique of dialectical reason attests to the profound difficulties with which philosophy is struggling. By virtue of his philosophical preoccupations, that is to say, those concerning philosophy, Sartre is close to official Marxism. He is also closer than he thinks to a theological philosophy of history and evolution, of which Teilhard de Chardin's doctrine offers us a fairly successful example. These are ambiguous neighbors, and dialogues are therefore very natural. We persist here in asserting that they are based on a fundamental misunderstanding concerning philosophy. Maurice Merleau-Ponty rubbed shoulders with Marxism from the start of his career, whereas Sartre only encountered Marxism after attempting an earlier systematization, being in nothingness. Merleau-Ponty accepted, later to reject them, the terms of the philosophical debate that substituted for the superseding of philosophy. He believed at the time that he could attain a total, exhaustive discourse, starting from a logical-ontological dilemma, either the primacy of being, material, natural, or the primacy of thought, spirit, consciousness. The philosopher soon came to see this dilemma as untenable. It was a choice between two attitudes, two postulates, two philosophical traditions, object and subject, that were equally unsustainable. For Merleau-Ponty, the pure thing and the pure consciousness were both impossible and inconceivable. The philosopher cannot start from two impossibilities, two abstractions, placed face to face. Merleau-Ponty believed he could situate his ontological principle between the two, between being and consciousness, the in itself and the for itself. As distinct from Sartre, what he sought was an ontological principle and not a starting point of a totalizing knowledge in the act of consciousness. He believed he had found this principle in the ambiguity between the two terms. He accordingly replaced the dilemma with a formula that he supposed, not without reason, to be more dialectical, neither one nor the other, but the two together. Neither being nor mind, neither the thing nor consciousness, but between the two, a position that effectively satisfied the requirements of dialectical thought, yes and no, if this position had not also required the superseding of philosophy itself. Merleau-Ponty thus grasped something essential in Marx's thought, the fact that the products and works of the human being tend towards autonomous being, without ever completely arriving at it. But he does not seem to have grasped the other side of this dialectical movement. For critical analysis, systematized philosophies and the categories of ontology no longer fit the purpose. On the other hand, the failure of proletarian revolution in an advanced industrial country, France, after the liberation, led Merleau-Ponty to draw the conclusion of the ambiguity of history. 32. The thesis of ambiguous history is strongly linked to an ontology of ambiguity. The philosopher took two ontological impossibilities, on the one hand, isolated things, the thing pure and simple, on the other hand, pure consciousness, the pure act of isolated consciousness. These two impossibilities he denied, both separately and together, basing himself on a phenomenological psychology of behavior and perception, in such a way as to constitute a mixture that he attributed to the body itself, the corporeal existence of the human being in his natural and social milieu. And then to historicity, instead of grasping, apropos things, and consciousness, the in itself and the for itself, the difficulties of metaphysics and its categories as such, Merleau-Ponty sought to rescue traditional ontology in favor of ambiguity, a debatable procedure. It perceives the problems, up to a certain point, only to bypass them or shift them. Then they lose their edge. Difficulties and contradictions are attenuated in ambiguity. The confrontation between lived experience and the historical falls into a kind of shadow. Was this deliberate chiaroscuro not a refuge, a manner of eluding the crisis of philosophy? Merleau-Ponty's theoretical position was not very sustainable. It was situated neither in being nor in knowing, neither in the object nor in the subject, neither in the in itself nor in the for itself, not even in their conflict, as Sartre had attempted, nor beyond these philosophical determinations. A kind of nostalgia for being predestined Merleau-Ponty to bury ontology. In his last book, I and Mind, 33, we see him confessedly orienting himself towards Heideggerian thought, that is to say, towards a philosophy of being, very much towards a vision, since he is dealing with pictorial art, of being as conceived philosophically. Sadly, he died well before the end of this trajectory. Undoubtedly, like Sartre and like Heidegger himself, he had two philosophies, or two ways of tackling philosophical problems, but, as distinct from the other two, the second of these was more philosophical than the first. 11th Aporia, Father and Son. Master and disciple, how should we understand Nietzsche's saying God is dead? 34, a saying with immense resonance, genuinely poetic? We encounter certain weak versions. One version is that of the traditional philosopher, rationalist or empiricist. Nietzsche strongly criticized traditional thought, which situated the true in the suprasensible. The Platonic theory of ideas marked Christian philosophy and theology. This had long been shaken, but Nietzsche gave it the coup de grace. What died was an abstract conception of transcendence. To this commentary we could add that the rehabilitation of the practico sensuous and of all the meanings of sense had been effected by Marx, and that Nietzsche, thus interpreted, is of little interest. The version of the materialist and atheist philosopher is opposite to this, but equally facile. Superstition disappeared, although the power of the Church survives both faith and superstition. Religious alienation as such is attenuated. Belief is reduced to an individual attitude, a kind of poetry that can be tolerated if it no longer has any political weight. There is no God. That has at last been perceived. a secular, lay, humanist morality can then be constituted. In sum, Nietzsche condensed into a vigorous formula the materialist philosophy of the 18th and 19th centuries. The resonance of such a summary might well be surprising. The believer replies, in the modern world, even if the church and churches maintain themselves as institutions, even if we are moving towards a certain ecumenism, faith grows blurred, and with it, morality. With morality, taboos, sanctions and fears disappear. Immoralism triumphs, values collapse. No value is without God. We come into anxiety and insufferable nihilism. As proof, Nietzsche himself and the consequences of his theory, the results of his cry of revolt and despair. Is it by chance that these versions, in their platitude, are philosophizing or theological? Let us now venture the strongest and most dangerous hypothesis, observing that, if it frees the imagination, permitting a kind of poetic exploration of the impossible, or of a beyond of the possible, it cannot take itself without irony. Irony teaches us not to take entirely seriously half-dreamy and half-conceptual investigations. It teaches us to play with the most disturbing truths and the most dangerous errors. We shall therefore permit ourselves a few moments of philosophical irony. It is up to the reader to read these pages with the same irony. A more obscure version than the others, and certainly more poetic, attributes to Nietzsche the surprising doctrine that God did exist. He has died. Let us make the attempt. Divinity has been the lived experience of humanity since its birth. Religion, accordingly, was not just an institution based on human weakness, or a projection by men of their own powers onto the screen of the clouds. The sacred and the divine, and perhaps the accursed and the diabolical, cannot be reduced to superstructures, ideologies, a play on primitive fears that is still short of systematic. Someone or something, neither completely someone nor completely something, sought to arise. From the infinite universe, the consciousness of an infinite being sought to be born. Theologies attest to this, as before them do cosmogonies and mythologies, each in its own fashion. Christian theology breaks the unity of God by trying to account for this genesis. Is the Father not the universe, nature? Is not the Son, as Word, the arising consciousness, with the result that Logos, Son of God, is also Son of Man? As for the ultimate reconciliation, the Spirit, this intervenes only as virtual, horizon of horizons. This infinite consciousness of infinite being, disseminated ever since it first arose, soon had to yield before the law of the world, finitude. What is born in the world, and out of the infinite world, universe, is always finite. What arises in the infinite becoming always possesses a determination, and therefore limits. The presence of the sacred and divine in history, surrounding human birth, shows a God who sought to be. God was, and remains, attempt and temptation, with its counterpart the diabolical and accursed. God did not die a good death. He had to be killed, an act that is properly inconceivable this side of conception, or beyond it. In order to be, to proclaim himself, man had to kill God. We still do have to kill him, perhaps at every moment. What could the divine be? Absolute spontaneity, the pure birth of what arises, the paradisiac encounter, or the chance of such an encounter, between man and nature. The divine suppresses struggle and action. It does not go into praxis. It does not insert itself into this. It implies the suspension of praxis. Who is responsible for the murder of God? Philosophy and the philosopher. They did not succeed. The task was far better accomplished by religions themselves. By instituting and institutionalizing the divine, they destroyed it. They fixed it in rituals and dogmas. Yet the death of God does not put an end to him. Many people still serve God, or believe that they do. They kill him and carry his corpse. Among these murderers of the divine, we still live the death of God. And Christ? He is the dead God, ritually killed each day by those who admit his presence, for whom he is deemed to die and who believe that they live in him, which confers on Christianity an unexpected meaning. In order to know the divine and its place in human historicity, history must go back beyond Christianity, towards the cradle of religions in the East. The Greeks already experienced the decline of the divine. Did the words Pan is dead not mark the end of human youth along with that of the divine? The history of religions, accordingly, could be considered in its literality, instead of being translated into rationalist language, which does not rule out radical criticism. In the same way, the history of philosophy, like that of religions, forms part of the history of being and consciousness. Religion took its stand on transcendence. Philosophy wagered on immanence. For religion, man contained in himself neither the reason of his being, nor the reason of his reason, nor the meaning of his life. Philosophies proclaimed that man contained in himself his raison d'etre. Yet they never managed to escape the dilemma raised by religion: man does not have his being in himself. And this is why there is the being of man, human being. Between man and being there is a split, duality. Therefore, either man submits to being, or he rebels. Either he is attached to being, or detaches himself from it and condemns himself to nothingness, to defeat, to nihilism. In order to escape this dilemma, philosophy has itself to wither away. Its properly philosophical concepts, immanence and transcendence, among others, have to be simultaneously discredited, and the situation of man conceived otherwise than in terms of these concepts. If the future of man is determined by the appropriation of his being, nature, the representation that separates man from his being must first be refuted. It is refuted in praxis. The split is superseded in action. Religion and philosophy disappear, with their conflict never resolved. What dies? A serious question to which it is both easy and hard to respond. What dies? Everything that has lived. Everything that exists. The totality gathered under the concept of end. Many philosophers have represented ending and death in terms of a biological or physiological pattern, borrowed from a relatively undeveloped representation of nature. Death results from a natural or historical process, from becoming in general, placed by some at the highest degree of both reality and thought, and by others at the lowest. Among these thinkers, let us class Hegel and even Marx, although with them more than one thought overflows this pattern. From this time on, during the period of the withering of philosophy, death has been brought into relationship with the human condition, with being or the consciousness of man. Man is familiar with death. He knows that he is going to die. Art, and knowledge itself, resulted from the effort to escape death, to create something durable. Philosophy included both this effort and a long meditation, always recommenced, on ending, on death, and on their meaning. Is meditation not still needed on accomplishment and in relation to the works of man, neither man viewed as a being of nature, enslaved to processes, nor man viewed outside of this marvelous mechanical nature? Works are neither nature as such nor man as such. Yet they are not to be understood outside of a relationship between man and the world and nature. Works are never someone, image of their creator or of the creator. And yet they have an originality close to that of human beings. They vary with the person or the individual. They are never completely something, no more than those magisterial realities that are also creations and works, society, the city. Even the commodity and money, which reify, are not completely things, but relations pulled onto the path of things. It is important not to conceive them in terms of crude reification and objectivity. Works are also born, they live and die. They exist. It seems that they fall into determinable sectors or domains, religion, art, philosophy, politics, etc., despite interferences or connections. It also seems that they all experience a rise, an apogee, a decline, or again, in natural terms, a youth, a maturity and an aging. What is it that dies? First of all, that which defined the human, that defined him by something else. Along with God, there perish truth, beauty, good, the three absolutes. Beauty, which proclaimed itself immortal, also dies. As likewise does being, the being of theologians and philosophers, accessible to man hic and nunc even though beyond his grasp, being that was simply being without nothingness, the infinite without finitude, as again that which founded, or seemed to found, authority over men, and that which defined, or seemed to define, perfection, happiness, joy, ideas and values. Along with God, too, dies justice. Far more than guarantor of the true, possessor of the good and protector of the beautiful, God was the just and the judge. He promised the final reversal, the redressing of wrongs, the end of lies and violence in the world. Justice and injustice basically lose their meaning along with the just and the last judgment. The arbitrariness of power has replaced justice and injustice. Injustice was formerly compelled, out of fear of the judge, to cover itself with the mask of justice, thus to conceal itself and lie, to take on the appearance of justice, and so accept compromises and not break out into open daylight. Now, arbitrariness is unmasked. Justice is no longer anything but the decision of force. There is no more injustice. It has been suppressed. However, justifications fall together with judge and judgment, with justice and injustice. With the justification of force revealing itself, force ceases forever to be justified. With the alienation of man, therefore, there falls that which defined man. God is dead, all is permitted. Nothing any longer limits cruelty, violence, arbitrariness. All is permitted, all is possible. And so man becomes possible. He advances in the desert, where the death of God abandons him. He walks in the cosmic solitude through which he still bears on his shoulders the corpse of his God. He discovers his terrible availability. By rendering himself capable and guilty of the murder of God, act in proof of freedom, man obliges himself to be. He is obliged, before being, to attain being. He redeems himself or releases himself from external being, other in relation to him, setting out on the hard road that leads him towards the possible, his free being. The death of God signifies the murder of God. The murder of God signifies the end of the world, the divine, and the end of a moment of man. The end of an alienated moment of man indicates the birth of man to himself, or rather, the continuation of ends and births, worlds and formation, moments, successions, forms. Birth and death go together. Supersession includes both these terms. Someone or something, always neither totally someone or totally something, is born and dies. On the mortal side, what is born loses something, being, presence. It distances itself, emerges from being and loses it by arising. But it also wins something, and first of all itself. Hence the necessary and difficult use of the concept of alienation. Becoming world and becoming of the world, is at the same time alienating, alienated, desalienating, realizing and derealizing. That which alienates in one sense, in another sense realizes and desalienates by making possible realization or actualization. The combat against alienation can reveal itself to be the path of a deeper alienation. Alienation, therefore, is never defined either by one of the terms in presence, in conflict in their reciprocal presence, or by the possibly productive pain of the conflict, but rather by a halt to superseding, the blockage of the possible. How could a dialectical development be otherwise determined? The pattern of becoming by way of a single feature, one-sidedly, by rise and perfection, comes from Aristotelian metaphysics. It ends up in a facile rationalism, naive optimism, the theory of continuous progress, bourgeois materialism, linear evolutionism. If there is dialectic, then development cannot fail to encompass gain and loss, fall back and rise, growth and decline, death and birth. Man is born as species by dying to the universe, to the infinite. He falls from the infinite into the finite. He appears therefore in the light, on earth, at the end of a becoming without assignable limits in the past and in space, a cosmic, physical, organic becoming with the not entirely false appearance of a finality. For he indeed is the end of what reflection calls evolutionary process, evolution. In order to come to the world, he dies to the world, to the inexhaustible power of cosmic forces, to the divine spontaneity of life, animal naivety and innocence. However, the world continues to surround the human species, and spontaneous life does not abandon it. This first birth continues for a long time. The world keeps a meaning. If it did not, then the sky and the sea, the earth and the light, would no longer have a presence for us. Yet the world affects people in two ways, by the bitter struggle to which it compels them, and by its gentle and favorable presence, the two aspects mingling in the imagination, in praxis, in reflection. Analytical examination of the material conditions of organic life, or of its transition to consciousness, or of historical conditions, in particular, labor, translates into an exact language, that of reflection, the poetic description of the totality. This poetic description of totality links up with, and rediscovers the immediacy of the lived, birth, etc., which authenticates it. Would poetic description not attain the empirical universal, on condition of having been purified by reflection and superseding this reflection? The effective exactness of scientific knowledge coexists with other truths, on other levels, at another level, on another scale. Man is born as individual by dying to the maternal world. This is the second moment of the individual, his second birth. For his birth turns out to be multiform, in reflexive empirical terms, biological, physiological, social, sexual, etc. by way of a singular contrast, the individual human being, this product and term of an immense becoming, is born prematurely. He comes into the world incapable of sufficing for himself. This condemns him to dependence and plays a great role in his formation. He traverses his maternal world, which plunges into the depths of cosmic and animal life, which extends into childhood and longer still in images. In order to be born to himself, the individual cannot dispense with living, through many conflicts, the collapse and death of the maternal world. During this test, he takes charge of his being, his body, his sexuality, his faculties and aptitudes, his environment and his time, and his absence of being, his availability, his uncertainties, his growing consciousness. In sum, his individual and social aims, his tasks, his possibilities. He traverses an ambiguous experience, end and beginning, death of the cosmic, archaic, primitive, infantile, imaginary world, accession to freedom. Is this all? No. What other births, and what other deaths, does the human take responsibility for on the journey to himself, that is to say, towards his possibility and his being free? What moments does he traverse by living the necessary collapse of a partial world lived as total? Nietzsche discovered this. Man must also traverse the death of God, of the sacred and the accursed, the divine and the cunning, of beauty and ugliness, etc., that is to say, the death of the Father. Why not add to these moments, distinct yet bound together and mingled, the cosmic, the maternal, the paternal or the divine, other moments, other tests? Such as philosophy, which, like God, defined man through alienating him by way of another truth. Economics and its history until worldwide communism. Politics and the state, same remark, they define the human from outside and from above. Art, which defines man by striking illuminations, and the human by exceptional instants, thus still external and alienating in the effort towards deliverance. If beauty proves to be moral, how could we believe in the eternity of the work, the divinity of art? Has not each great epoch of art been a funeral feast in honor of a departed moment? Each form or structure, conquered by history and civilization, thus contains both a victory and a vital degradation. Should not each of these worlds be lived as a test, and thus through to the end, to its term, its collapse? It follows from this that each of them collapses only by making itself explicit, by deploying all its virtualities, and only when it has fulfilled everything, summoned everything to itself, when it has proclaimed itself totality on the human, and thus finite, scale. In the course of this deployment, and only after this illusory and extravagant proclamation, the negativity that this world always already contained within itself asserts itself, gives it the lie, dismantles it, shatters it. Only an accomplished totality can reveal that it is not the totality. That is how the law of the world, the dialectical relationship between the infinite and the finite, shows itself. Each of these moments or each of these worlds is thus worlded, mondialisé, or will be so, mondializer. Before man can complete his traverse, arrive at his own encounter, perceive himself face to face, each of these worlds will have to detach itself, absolutize itself, fetishize itself, generalize itself and claim to be worldwide. In this sense, the history of religion illuminates world history. It contains the index of theoretical struggles, Marx. Every criticism commences and recommences with the criticism of religion. But every radical criticism illuminates the historicity of the human, that is to say, the totality of the trajectory, destiny, the destiny of freedom. After the criticism of religion comes the criticism of the state and politics. The two things link up and cut across one another. The finitude of man and his relationship with the world show through in mondialization. In this way the worldwide human is condemned to derision at the end of every accomplishment. Religion dominated the human world, and this was how the divine discredited and destroyed itself. Mendeus est mendeus. Once worlded and worldly, mondialisé et mondaine, God withered away. The stink of this decay still offends our noses. But already something else was advancing, pushing away the rotting corpse, proclaiming itself superior to the divine, worlding, mondialisant, in its turn. What? Economics, productive labor, and politics. Thus, the state, a worldwide monster, the coldest of cold monsters. And aestheticism. And technicity. The idolatry of the state, the greatest fetish on earth after God, certifies for us the death of the divine. The mondialization of politics and the state is pursued through fear and anger, hatred and revolt, in flows of blood, a path marked by monuments of pride and arrogance. It is accompanied by a radical critique of political alienation, Marx. The history of the state also contains a resume of world history, the summary of practical struggles. There are other worlds both imaginary and real, which their superseding shows to be simultaneously both real and imaginary, that of the imagination itself and of art, or that of philosophical abstraction. The becoming philosophy of the world, and the becoming world of philosophy, Marx, already almost accomplished with the Hegelian system and the state that this justified, is perfected with the officialized philosophy of the socialist states, with the mondialization of the state in politics. We thus live the exasperation and withering away of these inseparable abstractions, philosophy and the state, speculative representation and political representation. We are also traversing the collapse of the aesthetic imaginary that reactivates outdated moments, the cosmic, the archaic, the divine, the maternal, the infantile, of the lived. Modern aestheticism alienates human living by subordinating to these moments. The abstract and the imaginary, when mixed together, exacerbate one another. They condemn themselves together to destruction and self-destruction. In terms closer to the empirical, the mass media signify the devouring consumption of a culture piled up and condemned to an end at the very moment of its victory. They also signify the worldwide enervation of an abstraction become palpable, of imaginary intervening in the lived to the point of confusion, of the political and the public tracking the private and penetrating it. This signifies both extreme fetishism and the profanation of fetishes, the sullying and deterioration of both the abstract sublime and the bewildered imaginary. Mass communications are mystificatory and go hand in hand with incommunicability. In the same way, the fetishism of language goes hand in hand with the destruction of language. The confusion of the private and the public accompanies their aggravated split, their clash, and their mutual destruction. Need it be said that for a long time we have, to a high degree, suspended not judgment but irony? By pursuing the most adventurous hypothesis, we have arrived at assertions. Do these depend on that hypothesis? Perhaps they break free from this after a certain articulation. In order to grasp the path taken by human works and their relationship, it is unnecessary to accept the death and murder of God in the literal sense. It is enough to admit that philosophy constituted itself against religion and also against the state. Each time that it boldly waged its combat, the struggle strengthened it. But it was unable to avoid compromise and worse than compromise, reconciliations, symbioses. Philosophy was thus unable to prevail over its adversaries. It developed at the same time both against them and with them. Its fortunes followed the alliance with them, also reaching its own apogee. It was not even able to demonstrate their fate, accomplishment and end. In order to conceive this historical destiny, it was necessary already to conceive the superseding of philosophy, that is to say, philosophy as a work. There has always been in philosophy ideology, utopia, myth, in the contemporary generalized and rather vague sense of this word, which denotes a certain form of illusion and no longer, as in ancient Greece, a concrete relationship between man and nature, perceived or transposed, by way of figures, images and symbols. A representation, either disdaining or ignoring its presuppositions as well as its connection with praxis, distorted and mutilated reflection of the real. In its movement, philosophy was an ideology, an interpretation of the world aiming in vain to transform it by the force of spirit alone, the quest for a coherent purity in a world that was contradictory to say the least, and perhaps chaotic. It was utopia. Containing a representation of the origins of man and a projection of this past towards future perfection, it was both utopian and mythical. The share of myth increased in the period of withering, precisely because philosophy, as such, above all after Hegel, appeared as a history, a concatenation, and the philosopher as a face. There is now a myth of the philosopher. What ancestors, or what laggards of ill omen, could have written, "The philosopher will be leader"? The truth is rather that the philosopher stands close to the father, and the philosophical attitude to paternalism. Like the fleshly father, the paterfamilias, the philosopher begets. He educates with force and gentleness, with an iron fist, the system, or a velvet glove, persuasive discourse, rhetoric. Through his disciples, he summons crowds to him, and increasingly what he believes to be men as a whole. The philosopher is the spiritual father. The disciples stand between stubborn repetition of formulas learned and little understood, and contemplation of the inaccessible model, the master, and through him the true. They stand in the full flood of mimesis. This is how the true discourse, that of the philosopher, is transmitted from generation to generation, or would be transmitted, if the philosophical model were successful. If the philosopher borrows from fatherhood something of its prestige and power, philosophy has rendered a similar service to paternity. The son is son of his father, philosophical discourse has repeated since Aristotle, thus setting aside woman, nature, society, that is to say, praxis. The father contributes the form and stamps it on unformed matter, on empty and pure potential, woman. The father possesses the idea and ideas as part of his inheritance. The virtual and spiritual germ that he receives and transmits eminently contains the specific and social characteristics of human being, stable essence, intellecti, final cause and supreme reason. Philosophy, this final cause and reason, is the system, finally true. Thus philosophical fatherhood and family fatherhood have supported one another over the centuries. Each of them theorized customs or norms that were debatable and are now past their time. The father did have his grandeur. In patriarchal times, progenitor and chief, he led a community that he served, and on occasion used and abused. This grandeur has disappeared, like that of the knight or the prophet, like many grandeurs. All that remain are traces, words and expressions, images, symbols, ethical models. These semantic traces are sufficient to maintain the role, in conjunction with some functional survivals. And yet the victimized or disdained elements, woman, child, society, have regained their reality, sometimes in exaggerated or illusory form. After the disappearance of the functional, Forms persist, particularly in language, and institutions prolong what has historically dissolved. The father, like the philosopher, becomes institutional. Psychoanalysis contributes elements to the explanation and criticism of the myth of the father. But it does not deploy this as myth, and its critique is insufficiently radical. The sociological and political aspect is lacking, as well as the link with a praxis wider than the treatment of neuroses. In this sense, socialism such as it is, and despite, or on account of, its most debatable and most defective sides, is indeed at the head of the progress. By proclaiming Stalin father of the peoples, it has struck and discredited fatherhood far more than the most virulent anarchist proclamations attacking the family. By making philosophy official, by openly making philosophical reason raison d'etat, and the philosophical system the political system, openly and practically, and not just in the abstract as Hegel had done, it has contributed to the death of the philosopher and the metamorphosis of philosophy. In the same fashion, it is leading art to destruction by self-destruction. It is clearing the way with the state as its bulldozer. In the capitalist countries, philosophy is institutionalized only in the limited context of the university, culture and pedagogy. It is taught, and this teaching is left a wide margin of freedom, with the result that in certain conjunctures it offers a refuge to freedom. In the socialist countries, a philosophy is officialized that has been made obligatory. The end of philosophy is close, on condition that the point of Marxism, as radical critique, is sharpened and directed against the enormity of official Marxism as state ideology, and on condition that authentic Marxist theory, that of the realization of philosophy in the course of its superseding, is restored to the first rank. Face to face, vis-a-vis, we have the myths of non-philosophical life, that is to say, the everyday, and the philosophical myth, that of the philosopher. On the side of the non-philosophical world, we discover an amazing trilogy, the myth of the father, the myth of adult age, the myth of entry into life. These three myths are three aspects of a single representation with its foundation long in the past, which has become abstract and phantasmagorical. The father is the adult par excellence. He trains the adults who replace him. The adult is the man-made, complete, achieved. He is, strongly and powerfully. He is made because he has made himself, accepting life as it is, with its limits, but fulfilling what can be fulfilled within these limits. He has put an end to the uncertainties and follies of youth. He is form-stamped on this unformed matter, on empty and pure potential, life, adolescence. He has the fortune of being at the same time the classical type par excellence and, at least according to Peggy, the adventurer of modern times. To assimilate this plenitude, he has had to enter into life as one enters the father's house by crossing the threshold, entering through the front door, leaving outside his errors and illusions, a well-brought-up child or a prodigal son. 35 In the face of these everyday myths that are all one, the philosopher proclaims himself father, eternal adult, image of fully achieved man, announcing this, promulgating it, helping it to be born. He describes it and gives it a face, in two senses, in himself as human being, and in the system. He manages the entry into life, not of this or that particular child, but of the human species. The myths of philosophy and those of everyday life stand face to face. They reflect one another as each other's mirrors, and mirrors of a situation in the process of being superseded, precisely that in which the non-philosophical everyday and the non-everyday philosophy confront one another, render one another derisory, lead one another into the same slippage. The diverse defenders of philosophy seek in vain to save themselves by clutching at science, art, or simply art criticism, occultism, whatever they can. Apostrophe the function of philosophy, wrote Leon Brunschvi, has lost nothing of its import and its effectiveness, because it scrupulously attaches itself closely to exactness, subtlety, the complexity of scientific development. 36 In vain. The philosopher has lost all function, except when he becomes the promoter of official ideology and raison d'etat. He has lost his essential function, that of radical criticism. We can understand now the ever more frequent revolts against the philosopher and philosophy. The subtlety of Nietzsche, still philosophical, is increasingly remote. It was only a transition. Here is the virulent revolt. I turned away from philosophy when it became impossible for me to discover in Kant any human weakness. Compared to music, mysticism, and poetry, philosophical activity proceeds from a diminished impulse and a suspect depth, prestigious only for the timid and the tepid. The philosophical exercise is not fruitful. It is merely honorable. A métier without fate which pours voluminous thoughts into our neutral and vacant hours, the hours refractory to the Old Testament, to Bach, and to Shakespeare. The real problems begin only after having ranged or exhausted it. 37 And then we have cynical revolt and parody. It is just as if it were possible to take one or another famous philosophical text and replace certain key words by others, for example, being, by bullshit, canary, while the discourse preserves a sense, invariances, throughout this permutational game, faithful to the Heideggerian theory according to which human bullshit has itself proclaimed what it is on the basis of the world and the ego. It is always by way of the density of a field of bullshit that my presentation to myself is made. This procedure presents, among its other advantages, that of avoiding the confusion between bullshit immediate presence to self and the bullshit subject, whose revelation requires a mediation. 38 A lighter parody, but equally destructive, can be found almost everywhere, as when, for example, the weekly magazine Elle reminds us how Chanel reinvented woman and inspired a whole new world of channelism. Thanks to Chanel, women and girls have obtained a philosophy. 39 Philosophy and the philosopher had their grandeur and their beauty, like beauty itself. Today, these figures serve to cover something that can easily do without it, but that cannot appear without rousing unease, horror or anxiety, everyday life, power, technicality, profitability, and so forth. No one needs philosophy or the philosopher anymore. The latter, alone in his reflection, sets himself up as a criterion of knowledge, or wisdom, or being. We know, however, that he is there. Like a watcher in a night deprived of any sacred character, a night without stars, a night without fears, as if in a vast warehouse. The philosopher still claims to undertake unending research, bottomless fear, unlimited expectation, sustaining a double illusion. He no longer meditates, he reflects. He teaches philosophy. He discourses on other philosophers, for other philosophers. By logology and egology, he perilously approaches pleonism. He does not really watch. If he awaits, it is with the same waiting, the same hope or the same despair as other people, those of the everyday, less outers, less quotidians.